Imagine waiting 50 years, knowing your daughter's killer is out there, free. For half a century, justice was silent. But today, science is rewriting the past, and murderers who thought they got away are finally being unmasked. This is more than just solving crimes. This is about families who never gave up hope, detectives who refuse to close files, and the revolutionary science that's changing everything we thought we knew about justice. The 1960s through 1980s were the golden age for getting away with murder. Police departments across America worked with primitive tools, magnifying glasses, basic fingerprinting, and witness testimony that faded with time. Evidence was collected, yes. Blood samples carefully preserved, hair fibers meticulously cataloged, clothing examined under crude microscopes. But the most crucial question remained unanswered. Who did this belong to? The statistics are staggering. In the United States alone, over 250,000 murder cases remain unsolved, each file representing a family torn apart, a community living in fear, and a killer who walked free. These weren't just numbers in a filing cabinet. These were daughters who never came home, mothers whose lives were cut short. Entire families left wondering, will we ever know the truth? Then came 1986, a year that would change criminal investigation forever. In a small English village, Dr. Alec Jeffreys used DNA profiling to solve a double murder case. For the first time in human history, genetic material could definitively identify a killer. America took notice immediately. By the late 1980s, DNA analysis arrived on American soil, and the implications were revolutionary. What had been invisible to the naked eye suddenly became the most powerful evidence in any courtroom. The FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, creating America's first national DNA database. By the 1990s, every major police department had access to this game-changing technology. But there was a critical limitation. DNA databases only worked if the suspect was already in the system. If a killer had never been arrested, their genetic profile remained just another unsolved puzzle, a string of letters and numbers with no name attached. The solution came from an unexpected source. While millions of Americans were discovering their ancestry through services like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, they unknowingly became part of the largest criminal investigation tool ever created. Enter genetic genealogy, the revolutionary technique that would crack cases everyone thought were impossible to solve. Here's how it works. Investigators upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch. Instead of looking for exact matches, they search for genetic relatives, third cousins, great aunts, distant family connections that share small portions of DNA with the unknown killer. Then comes the detective work. Genealogists construct detailed family trees, tracking marriages, births, deaths, and geographic movements across generations. They follow genetic breadcrumbs until they narrow down to potential suspects. The technique's first major victory became legendary in law enforcement circles, the capture of the Golden State Killer. For over 4 decades, he was California's most terrifying phantom. Joseph James DeAngelo committed over 50 rapes and 13 murders between the 1970s and 1980s. He was methodical, calculating, and seemingly invisible. Police had his DNA from multiple crime scenes, but no match in any database. Hundreds of detectives worked the case. Thousands of suspects were eliminated. Millions of dollars were spent on investigations that led nowhere. Then in 2018, a team of investigators tried something unprecedented. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. The result? A distant genetic connection to relatives DeAngelo had never met. People who had innocently submitted their DNA to learn about their family history. Working backward through generations of family records, investigators built a massive family tree. They tracked descendants, cross-referenced geographical locations, and narrowed their search to a handful of suspects. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Sacramento, became their primary target. When investigators secretly collected DNA from items he discarded, The match was perfect. After 40 years of terror, the Golden State Killer was finally unmasked. D'Angelo's capture opened the floodgates. Across America, cold case units began dusting off their oldest, most challenging files. The results have been extraordinary. Case study: Carla Walker, 1974. 17-year-old Carla Walker was enjoying a Valentine's Day date in Fort Worth, Texas, when she was abducted from a bowling alley parking lot. Her body was found 3 days later. For 46 years, her family lived without answers. In 2020, genetic genealogy identified Glenn McCorley as her killer. He was 77 years old when arrested, a man who had lived freely for nearly half a century while Carla's family suffered in silence. Case study: Gwen Miller, 1969. In rural Montana, 19-year-old Gwen Miller was brutally murdered after her car broke down on a remote highway. The case haunted local law enforcement for over 50 years. Using genetic genealogy, investigators finally identified her killer in 2019, solving Montana's oldest cold case and bringing closure to a family that had waited an entire lifetime for answers. Case study: The Bear Brook Murders, 1985. In a 55-gallon barrel in New Hampshire's Bear Brook State Park, investigators found the remains of a woman and 3 children. For decades, they remained nameless, known only as Jane Doe and 3 young victims of unspeakable violence. The case was so cold, so hopeless, that it became a training exercise for new investigators. But genetic genealogy changed everything. In 2017, using DNA evidence, researchers not only identified the victims, but also uncovered a serial killer named Terry Peter Rasmussen, who had used multiple identities across several states for decades. Case study: The Buckskin Girl, 1981. For 37 years, she was known only as the Buckskin Girl, a young woman found murdered along an Ohio highway wearing distinctive buckskin clothing. Despite countless tips and national media attention, her identity remained a mystery. In 2018, genetic genealogy revealed her name: Marcia Lenore King, a 21-year-old from Arkansas who had been missing since 1981. Her family had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. When they received the call confirming her identity, it was both heartbreaking and healing. Case study: The Boy in the Box, 1957. In Philadelphia, one of America's most haunting cold cases involved a young boy found dead in a cardboard box in 1957. For over 65 years, his identity remained unknown, despite massive public campaigns and police investigations. Though not yet fully resolved, genetic genealogy has provided new leads in 2022, bringing investigators closer than ever to identifying this child and potentially solving one of the nation's oldest and most heartbreaking mysteries. Case study: April Tinsley, 1988. 8-year-old April Tinsley was abducted while walking to a friend's house in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Her killer taunted police for years afterward, leaving threatening notes in neighborhoods. Despite DNA evidence and decades of investigation, the case remained cold. In 2018, genetic genealogy led investigators to John Miller, a man who had lived just miles from where April was found. After 30 years of fear and frustration, her family finally had justice. Case study: The Loma Prieta Jane Doe, 1979. Found in the California mountains after an earthquake, this unidentified woman became known as Loma Prieta Jane Doe. For over 40 years, she remained nameless despite extensive forensic reconstruction and media coverage. In 2021, genetic genealogy revealed her identity: Patricia Skipple, a 33-year-old mother from Ohio. Her family had been searching for her since 1979, never knowing she had traveled to California where she met her tragic end. Case study: The Sumter County Does, 1976. 2 bodies found in a wooded area of South Carolina remained unidentified for over 40 years. Known as Jock Doe and Jane Doe, they appeared to be young people, possibly runaways or transients from the 1970s. Through genetic genealogy in 2020, they were identified as James Paul Freund and Pamela Mae Buckley, both teenagers from New York who had left home and traveled south together. Their families had been searching for decades, never knowing their fate until science finally provided answers. Behind every cold case lies a human story of unimaginable loss. For families of victims, the years between the crime and resolution are filled with sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and a grief that never fully heals. Consider the psychological toll. Mothers who jump every time the phone rings, hoping it might be news about their child's case. Fathers who become obsessed with true crime shows, searching for clues that might help solve their daughter's murder. Siblings who grow up in the shadow of a tragedy that defined their childhood. Many families develop complex relationships with law enforcement. Some become advocates, working closely with detectives and pushing for new investigative techniques. Others become skeptical, frustrated by years of false hopes and dead-end leads. The advent of genetic genealogy has brought an unexpected emotional complexity. Suddenly, cases that had been dormant for decades are active again. Families who had learned to live with uncertainty now face the possibility of answers. And with those answers, new forms of pain and healing. Expert testimony. Dr. Sarah Williams, forensic psychology. When families finally get answers after decades of waiting, it's not always the relief people expect. There's often survivor's guilt, anger about lost time, and the realization that justice, while important, cannot undo the trauma or bring back their loved one. The technology that makes these breakthroughs possible represents one of the most sophisticated scientific endeavors of our time. Modern DNA analysis can extract usable genetic profiles from evidence that would have been worthless just 20 years ago. Consider the challenges. Crime scene DNA is often degraded, contaminated, or mixed with genetic material from multiple people. Environmental factors like heat, moisture, and time can damage genetic markers. Sometimes investigators are working with samples smaller than a pinhead. Advanced techniques like Y chromosome analysis allow scientists to trace paternal lineages across generations. Mitochondrial DNA analysis can identify remains even when traditional nuclear DNA has degraded beyond use. STR, short tandem repeat, analysis can create genetic profiles from increasingly small samples. But perhaps most importantly, the cost of DNA analysis has plummeted. What once required months of laboratory work and thousands of dollars can now be completed in days for hundreds of dollars. This accessibility has democratized cold case investigations, allowing smaller police departments to tackle cases they previously couldn't afford to pursue. Technical expert Dr. Mark Rodriguez, DNA laboratory director, we're now extracting usable DNA from evidence that's 50, 60, even 70 years old. Bloodstains on clothing, hair trapped in jewelry, saliva on stamps. Materials that would have been considered worthless in the past are now giving us complete genetic profiles. The success of genetic genealogy in American cold cases has sparked international interest and cooperation. Countries around the world are adapting these techniques to solve their own decades-old mysteries. In the United Kingdom, the same country where DNA profiling was first developed, investigators are using genetic genealogy to solve cases from the 1960s and 1970s. The Yorkshire Ripper case, one of Britain's most notorious serial killer investigations, has benefited from modern genetic techniques to identify previously unknown victims and crime scenes. Canada has embraced genetic genealogy to solve cold cases in both urban and remote areas. The vast geographic distances that once made investigations nearly impossible are now less relevant when genetic databases can connect suspects across provinces and territories. European countries face unique challenges due to stricter privacy laws, but they're finding ways to adapt the technology while respecting citizen rights. France, Germany, and the Netherlands have all successfully used genetic genealogy to solve cold cases while maintaining strict protocols for data protection. International perspective. Inspector James MacDonald, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Cross-border cooperation has become essential. A killer might commit crimes in one country, but their relatives might have submitted DNA to genealogy services in another. We're working together in ways that would have been impossible even 10 years ago. But this revolutionary technology has sparked an equally revolutionary debate. Critics raise serious questions about genetic privacy and constitutional rights. When you submit your DNA to learn about your ancestry, should that information be accessible to law enforcement? What about your relatives who never consented to genetic testing, but could be implicated through family connections? Privacy advocates argue that genealogy databases create a form of genetic surveillance, turning innocent people into involuntary participants in criminal investigations. They warn of a future where genetic privacy becomes extinct. Supporters counter with compelling arguments. Every killer identified means dangerous criminals are removed from society. Every case solved brings justice to victims, families who have waited decades for answers. They argue that solving heinous crimes outweighs privacy concerns. Law enforcement agencies have responded by developing strict protocols for genetic genealogy investigations. Most require traditional evidence to support genetic leads before making arrests. Some states have passed legislation regulating the use of these techniques. The debate continues in courtrooms, legislatures, and communities across America. Where do we draw the line between public safety and personal privacy? The widespread use of genetic genealogy has created unexpected consequences that extend far beyond criminal investigations. Families have discovered shocking secrets about their ancestry, including hidden adoptions, unknown siblings, and paternity revelations that occurred decades ago. These discoveries, known as non-paternity events or NPEs, affect an estimated 2 to 5% of all genealogy searches. While searching for a killer, investigators sometimes uncover family secrets that have been hidden for generations. This has forced law enforcement to develop protocols for handling sensitive family information that's uncovered during criminal investigations. The technology has also revealed the interconnected nature of human genetics in ways that surprise even scientists. Through genetic genealogy, researchers have discovered that many Americans are more closely related than previously understood, with most people of European descent sharing common ancestors within the last 1,000 years. Genetic counselor testimony, Dr. Lisa Thompson. We're seeing families torn apart by genetic revelations that were never meant to be discovered. A simple genealogy search to solve a murder case can reveal that someone's father isn't their biological parent, or that they have siblings they never knew existed. Interestingly, the success of genetic genealogy has begun to influence criminal behavior itself. Modern criminals are increasingly aware that DNA evidence can link them to crimes decades later, leading to changes in how crimes are committed. Some criminals now take elaborate precautions to avoid leaving genetic evidence, using bleach to destroy biological materials or wearing multiple layers of protection. Others have become more transient, moving across jurisdictions to complicate investigations. But these precautions also create new investigative opportunities. The very act of trying to avoid DNA detection can become evidence itself. Unusual purchasing patterns, excessive cleaning supplies, or abnormal behavior patterns can now serve as investigative leads. Law enforcement has also evolved their techniques. Crime scene investigators now collect evidence with future technologies in mind, preserving samples that might not be useful today but could become crucial as analytical techniques improve. Criminal behavior expert, Dr. Robert Hayes, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. We're seeing an arms race between criminal methodology and investigative technology. As our techniques improve, criminal behavior adapts, which in turn drives us to develop even more sophisticated investigative methods. The financial impact of genetic genealogy extends far beyond law enforcement budgets. Cold cases that are successfully solved often lead to civil lawsuits, insurance claims, and property disputes that have been pending for decades. Families of murder victims frequently pursue wrongful death lawsuits against perpetrators, even when those perpetrators are elderly or deceased. Insurance companies must reassess policies and payouts based on new information about the circumstances of deaths that occurred decades ago. The cost-effectiveness of genetic genealogy has also transformed police department priorities. Departments that once allocated minimal resources to cold cases now find that genetic genealogy investigations can be more successful than traditional active investigations. A typical genetic genealogy investigation costs between $5,000 and $15,000, compared to traditional cold case investigations that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years. The success rate for genetic genealogy investigations exceeds 60%, compared to less than 5% for traditional cold case methods. Chief Maria Rodriguez, Denver Police Department. From a budget perspective, genetic genealogy is transformative. We can now solve cases that would have required dozens of detectives and years of work. It's allowed us to bring justice to families while being responsible stewards of taxpayer money. We stand at a remarkable intersection of science and justice. Technologies that seemed like science fiction just decades ago are now standard tools in every major police department. For investigators, genetic genealogy represents the most significant advancement in criminal justice since fingerprinting was introduced over a century ago. Cold case units that once faced impossible odds now have realistic hope of solving their most challenging cases. For families of victims, these breakthroughs represent something even more valuable: closure. After decades of wondering, worrying, and waiting, they finally have answers. The people responsible for destroying their loved ones are being held accountable. For criminals who thought they had escaped justice, the message is clear. Science never forgets. DNA doesn't lie. And no matter how much time has passed, truth has a way of surfacing. The next chapter of this story is being written right now. In laboratories across America, scientists are analyzing evidence from cases that have been cold for decades. In police departments, detectives are reopening files their predecessors thought would never be solved. And somewhere, a family that has waited years for justice is about to get a phone call that will change everything. The age of the unsolved murder may finally be coming to an end.